Okay, let's unpack this. The entire U.S. school system, impacting over 50 million children, screeched to a halt in about a week during March of 2020.
Right.
Just let that sink in. A system that vast,
Yeah.
stopping that suddenly. And the question I keep coming back to, and I know many of you do too, is this.
Yeah.
Have we truly reckoned with how and why that happened?
That's the crucial question we're tackling today. This deep dive examines the multifaceted reasons behind those widespread school closures and the related COVID-19 policies in the U.S.
Right.
Our guide will be a recent, really illuminating YouTube interview with David Zweig, the author of An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions.
Ah, Zweig.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might recall his earlier work on the origins of COVID-19 and the initial efforts to maybe downplay it.
Exactly.
So, listener, our goal for you in this deep dive is to really grasp the complexities and the driving forces behind these massive decisions. We want to move past that initial, almost simplistic narrative we were all given, novel virus, uncharted territory, building the plane while flying it. We're aiming to extract the core insights, uncover some truly surprising facts, and ultimately get a clearer picture of what actually transpired.
And what's striking right off the bat is that the U.S. government wasn't starting from scratch. I mean, there were existing pandemic response plans developed by the CDC in 2007 and again in 2017.
Okay.
These frameworks were largely based on how to manage an influenza pandemic.
Right, so you'd assume there was some kind of established protocol. But here's where it gets really interesting. Zweig discovered that these pre-existing plans weren't exactly based on solid science. Apparently, they included some pretty questionable assumptions, including what he terms arbitrary figures for how easily children could transmit a virus. I mean, arbitrary, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
It certainly doesn't. And perhaps even more telling is Zweig's finding that the government very quickly deviated from even these flawed plans.
Oh, wow.
So, as he puts it, the actual response was 2 steps removed from a sober, logical, thoughtful response. We had plans with shaky foundations, and then we didn't even, stick to those.
Oh. So the virus arrives. Those early weeks are undeniably chaotic, and then we get the announcement in March 2020. 15 days to slow the spread. I remember that so clearly.
Me too.
The rationale was to flatten the curve, prevent our hospitals from being overwhelmed, and that included closing schools.
And of course, that initial 15-day period was quickly extended to 30 days.
Right.
This prompts a key question. What was the underlying rationale for that continuation? Zweig recounts his own early observation, seeing the decline in case numbers in New York City around that time, and naturally expecting schools to reopen. But they stayed closed.
That's the real head-scratcher, isn't it? We were told the closures were about flattening the curve flattened, yet the school stayed shut.
Exactly.
And Zweig points out a significant lack of critical questioning of these extensions from mainstream institutions and the media at the time. It was almost like that frog in the pot idea. The temperature just kept creeping up. And, nobody really jumped out to question it forcefully.
Yeah, it sort of just happened. Connecting this to a broader understanding, we need to consider the various potential motivations that might have underpinned these extended closures. Some might argue for a strongman strategy, focusing on protecting the elderly and those with comorbidities while allowing younger, less vulnerable populations to continue with their lives.
Right, the focus protection idea, sort of.
Kind of. However, as Zweig points out, the practical implementation of such a clearly segmented lockdown presented immense challenges.
Exactly. The notion that everyone could just stay home was, according to Zweig, a completely unrealistic projection.
Totally unrealistic.
You had a huge number of essential workers who had to continue their daily routines and interactions. And when you factor in the realities of family life, single parents needing childcare, children being cared for by grandparents, the idea of a true lockdown where children weren't interacting in some way just, it falls apart.
It really does. This leads to Zweig's argument that under those real-world conditions, using school closures as a primary strategy to significantly curb transmission was largely, in his words, bogus and absurd.
Bogus and absurd. Strong words.
Yeah. Even with some level of lockdown in place, societal mixing continued. He also introduces this interesting concept of voltage drop, the natural tendency for adherence to strict protocols to decrease over time.
Right. People can only maintain that level of intense restriction for so long.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And when you consider the sheer duration of some of these closures lasting over a year in some states,
Over a year.
while simultaneously sectors like casinos, bars, and restaurants were reopening, it really makes you wonder about the actual public health logic at play. What was really going on?
This is where Zweig's analysis of the role of politics and groupthink becomes really compelling.
Oh,
The data he presents reveals a distinct correlation between the political leaning of a state, county, or school district, whether it predominantly leaned Democrat or Republican, and both the likelihood and the length of school closures.
wow.
What's truly striking is that there was no corresponding correlation with the actual severity of the virus in those specific areas.
That's a powerful insight. So it wasn't driven by the level of risk, necessarily.
It seems not. It was driven more by political alignment. Zweig concludes that groupthink and tribalism played a really significant role in these decisions.
Okay.
And he highlights a specific moment that acted as a major turning point. President Trump's tweet stating, "We need to open the schools now."
Right, I remember that tweet.
What's fascinating is the almost immediate polarizing effect of that seemingly direct statement. According to Zweig, it essentially galvanized opposition to school reopenings on the left.
Hi.
And he provides a really illustrative example with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP. Initially, they had actually issued guidance supporting a return to in-person schooling.
They did.
But then, very shortly after Trump's tweet, they get a complete reversal. Their revised statement emphasized the need to listen to the experts and, crucially, mention the necessity of significant financial resources for schools to reopen safely.
Ah, the funding angle.
And here's a detail that really underscores the political undercurrents. That second AAP statement, the one advocating for continued closures contingent on funding, was co-signed by the two largest teachers' unions in the United States.
Okay, that definitely raises some serious questions about the motivations at play. It brings to mind the experiences of individuals like Alex Good, the teacher who faced considerable backlash for publicly questioning the prevailing narrative around school closures.
Right.
What's Zweig's perspective on the role of teachers' unions in all of this?
Well, Zweig is careful not to solely lay blame at the feet of the unions. His argument is that the unions couldn't have effectively demanded certain conditions for reopening unless public health officials were also publicly deeming those conditions necessary for safety.
I see. So they needed that official cover, essentially.
Pretty much. He uses the example of HEPA filters in schools. These were widely promoted as a crucial requirement for a safe return to in-person learning.
Right. I remember hearing a lot of emphasis on the need for improved ventilation in schools. Filters, ventilation, all that.
But Zweig's research uncovers a critical point. There is actually no robust study demonstrating that the installation of HEPA filters in schools significantly reduced the transmission of the virus.
No study, really.
Not one showing meaningful reduction in that setting, according to him. He contrasts this with the experience in Europe, where millions of students returned to their classrooms in the spring of 2020, often without any sophisticated air filtration systems in place.
Right.
And without any noticeable surge in transmission rates.
That's a really powerful comparison. Millions of kids back in school across Europe, no major issues, and here we were insisting on these potentially ineffective and certainly costly measures.
Exactly. And Zweig also points to other contrived reasons that were given for keeping a school's closed justifications that simply weren't factors in schools that were already operating safely in other parts of the world. It just didn't line up. This leads us to Zweig's concept of a reckoning, which, in his view, fundamentally means an honest acknowledgement of the mistakes that were made.
Okay, a reckoning.
He describes the initial dominant narrative: kids are fine, so we need to close schools. Then, as the accumulating evidence contradicted that, the narrative subtly shifted to, it was a regrettable situation, we were in the fog of war, we did the best we could with the information we had. You know that one.
Oh yeah, the fog of war line.
Yeah.
But Zweig's intention with his book is to serve as a necessary correction to that revised narrative.
Yes.
Yeah.
He lays out what he calls a tick-tock chronology of what was actually known in real time, information that was often overlooked or actively dismissed.
So the information was there.
Exactly. As he puts it, and this is a really crucial takeaway for you listening, don't ever buy into this narrative that we simply did the best we could because there was so much we didn't know. That's incorrect. We had access to information, but there was a choice made, either consciously or unconsciously, not to fully consider or accept it.
Wow. Okay. So what were the real harms inflicted on children as a result of these prolonged school closures? I mean, we all have a general sense of the negative impacts, but what specific findings did Zweig's research highlight?
The harms, as Zweig describes them, were substantial and varied in their severity depending on a child's individual circumstances and their home environment. That makes sense, right?
Sure.
However, he emphasizes that children from underprivileged backgrounds were disproportionately affected.
Right.
It's a particularly stark irony, as he notes, that policies often championed by those who advocate for the disadvantaged ended up inflicting the most harm on that very group.
It really is a bitter irony. What specific types of harm are we talking about, like concretely?
He details a wide range of significant issues. Considerable negative impacts on children's mental health, physical harm tragically, including an increased vulnerability for children in abusive households.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, evidenced by the initial drop and subsequent devastating consistency of abuse reports. There was also a surge in screen time, unhealthy shifts in eating patterns and BMI, and of course, significant academic setbacks, learning loss.
And he directly addresses that argument that was sometimes made.
Yeah.
It's better to be dead than to have lower grades. I mean, a horrible argument, but it was out there.
He unequivocally refutes that by stating that school closures did not prevent deaths in children, so it was a completely false choice, a false dichotomy.
Okay.
He also tackles the argument that closures were necessary to protect vulnerable family members, citing evidence that suggests open schools did not lead to increased rates of community transmission.
Really?
Yeah, and often had lower rates than the surrounding areas due to the continued mixing of people outside of the school environment anyway. Kids were still seeing people, adults were still moving around.
So, according to Zweig's analysis, there was fundamentally no benefit to these closures, no upside to weigh against the harms.
Precisely. As he powerfully concludes, there was no trade-off, there was only harm, this benefited no one, this was all for nothing.
Wow. All for nothing.
He acknowledges that some children in stable, supportive home environments might have weathered the storm relatively okay, but he stresses the devastating consequences for those with learning disabilities, IEPs, and special needs who lost access to crucial in-person services. Those services just vanished overnight for many.
It really highlights the disconnect, doesn't it, between the policymakers, many of whom were in that laptop class, and fared reasonably well during the pandemic.
Right. Working from home, kids maybe had more resources.
And the lived realities of millions of children and families facing vastly different circumstances.
Absolutely. And Zweig points to pre-pandemic academic research that already indicated school closures were not an effective strategy for pandemic response. This wasn't new information.
So we already kind of knew this.
The literature suggested it, yeah. Furthermore, the real-world experience in Europe during the spring of 2020, where the reopening of schools did not cause a spike in COVID-19 cases, provided strong evidence that schools were not primary drivers of transmission.
It's interesting that even within communities, there were varying perspectives on school closures. Zweig touches on how lower socioeconomic status often correlated with worse health outcomes during the pandemic.
Which is true in general, unfortunately.
Right, but emphasizes that school closures were not the appropriate solution to that particular problem.
Exactly. He also mentions a really insightful study by Vladimir Kogan, which showed that parents in more liberal-leaning school districts who initially favored school closures actually shifted their views and became more supportive of reopening once it occurred.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it suggests a potential preference for the established status quo, whatever it might be. Maybe inertia plays a role.
Interesting. Now, Zweig himself was present at the unveiling of the Great Barrington Declaration in October 2020. For listeners who might not be familiar, could you briefly explain the core tenets of that declaration?
Sure. The Great Barrington Declaration was a public statement signed by numerous scientists and public health experts advocating for a different approach to managing the pandemic, one centered around focused protection.
Okay.
The core idea was to concentrate efforts on shielding the most vulnerable populations of elderly, those with serious comorbidities, while allowing the rest of society, particularly younger, healthier people, to resume more normal life to build immunity.
And schools.
A central tenet of the declaration was the unequivocal assertion that school and university closures offered no significant benefit and caused immense harm. They were strongly against them.
And as Wade points out, despite the core ideas of focused protection being fairly mainstream in epidemiological thinking prior to the pandemic, the signatories of the declaration faced immediate and intense criticism and even outright dismissal, called fringe, right?
Oh, absolutely. Malign. The fundamental argument, as Weig summarizes it, was that the virus would continue to spread regardless of the severity of restrictions, and that highly restrictive measures didn't demonstrably improve overall outcomes when compared to less disruptive approaches.
Right.
He often points to comparisons like Florida versus California or Sweden versus other European nations to illustrate this point: different policies, but often similar outcomes in the long run.
Now, the reported death toll from COVID-19 in the U.S. is tragically high, over 1 million lives lost. Zwig addresses this aspect as well, correct? How does he square that?
He does, and he references a CDC study that indicated a significant proportion, around 32.5%, I think it was, of reported pediatric COVID deaths had no plausible direct link to the virus being the primary underlying cause of death.
32%, wow.
Yeah, meaning the child died with COVID, not necessarily from COVID as the main driver. He does clarify that this specific ratio doesn't appear to hold true for adult mortality figures. It seems specific to the pediatric numbers they analyzed.
Okay, important clarification. So, while acknowledging the immense loss of life, Zweig shifts the focus of scrutiny to the effectiveness of the public health measures that were implemented.
Precisely. The critical question isn't just the total number of deaths, but whether the specific measures enacted in free societies actually succeeded in significantly altering the long-term trajectory and the overall death burden of the virus.
Right. Did the interventions work?
Exactly. He draws a distinction between vaccines, which he acknowledges demonstrated some level of efficacy, particularly for vulnerable individuals,
Okay.
and other non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs.
And what's his overall assessment of the effectiveness of those other NPIs? Things like masking, distancing, closures?
He argues that there's no compelling evidence to suggest that NPIs like widespread social distancing, mask mandates, enhanced air filtration in public spaces, school closures, strict 6-foot distancing rules, and mass quarantines were effective in free societies at significantly reducing the overall death burden.
So basically none of those major societal interventions.
That's his argument, based on the evidence he's seen. He returns to the Florida versus California comparison, noting that despite vastly different approaches to NPIs, their overall excess death rates were quite similar in the end.
He also brings up the Swiss cheese analogy that was frequently used to justify these multiple layers of interventions. Remember that?
Oh yeah, the layers of protection. He points out that the very use of that analogy tacitly admitted the uncertainty surrounding the effectiveness of any single intervention. If one layer worked perfectly, you would need 10 others, right?
Good point.
He critiques the just do everything approach as being largely devoid of a strong evidence base, and highlights the notable absence of rigorous, randomized controlled studies to properly evaluate the efficacy of these various measures as they were rolled out.
It sounds like a response driven more by a sense of urgency, do something, anything, than by established scientific rigor.
Exactly, sort of throwing everything at the wall. And he highlights a later study focusing on the impact of 6-foot versus 3-foot social distancing in Massachusetts schools, which found no discernible difference in transmission rates between the two.
No difference between 3 and 6 feet.
Apparently not in that school setting. He emphasizes that this important research was initiated by individual physicians rather than by the government agencies that were responsible for implementing and overseeing these policies. They weren't testing their own rules.
It's a pretty damning indictment of the overall approach, isn't it? Just sort of making rules without checking if they work.
He uses a very powerful analogy. Imagine a medical doctor prescribing numerous untested medications, all with known potential side effects, without having any clear understanding of which, if any, are actually effective. That, in essence, is how he characterizes much of the pandemic response. Just keep piling on interventions.
Yikes. Now, Zweig also delves into the topic of vaccine efficacy and the issue of myocarditis, particularly in younger males.
Right. While acknowledging that his primary expertise isn't in vaccine science overall, he does discuss his reporting on what he describes as the unambiguous signal indicating myocarditis as a potential side effect, especially in young men post-vaccination.
Okay, a signal he reported on?
Yes. He notes the initial tendency to dismiss these concerns as conspiratorial or rare, despite accumulating evidence suggesting a link that needed investigation.
And he shares a concerning anecdote about a physician working in a pediatric intensive care unit.
Yes, this physician observed a clear and concerning increase in cases of myocarditis in young adults following the widespread rollout of vaccines, a higher number than they had seen in an entire year of treating COVID-19 cases in children.
More myocarditis post-vaccine than COVID cases pre-vaccine.
In their specific ICU observation, yes. And when this physician attempted to report these observations through established channels, they were actually admonished by their superior for sharing information that contradicted the prevailing public health narrative, told to basically quiet down.
Again, it points to this pattern of suppressing questions and information that didn't align with the established viewpoint. Don't question the narrative.
Which he directly links to the broader tendency to dismiss anyone doing their own research. That phrase became almost a joke, right? While at the same time highlighting the numerous instances where so-called experts made significant errors throughout the pandemic. So who do you trust?
It's a tough question. So in Zweig's analysis, who ultimately bears responsibility for these outcomes, is it Fauci? Is it the CDC?
Well, he acknowledges Dr. Fauci's prominent role as a public figurehead, but emphasizes that the responsibility extends to the entirety of the public health establishment.
A whole system.
Yeah. He makes the point that average clinical physicians relied heavily on the guidance coming from authorities like Dr. Fauci and the CDC, but the CDC's own recommendations weren't always based on robust scientific evidence, as we've discussed. So it's less about assigning individual blame, though accountability matters, and more about identifying systemic flaws within the public health system and the decision-making process.
Okay. Learning lessons, basically.
Exactly. Zweig stresses the critical importance of learning from these systemic failures as we move forward. He highlights the fundamental lesson that medical intuition, just going with your gut, can often be misleading or plain wrong, and underscores the absolute necessity of adhering to evidence-based practices. He draws parallels to historical examples in medicine where initially intuitive practices like how babies should sleep or handling peanut allergies were later proven to be harmful or ineffective by actual evidence.
Right, science evolves.
His concluding thought on this is that a significant portion of the pandemic response was ultimately driven by intuition, groupthink, politics, maybe fear, rather than solid, verifiable evidence.
It certainly sounds like the implications of Zweig's analysis extend far beyond just the COVID-19 pandemic itself. This is bigger than just COVID.
That's a key point he emphasizes. He frames the entire COVID-19 response as an extended and critical case study in flawed decision-making during a crisis. How do we make good decisions under pressure?
Yeah.
His hope is that policymakers, and indeed all of us, you listening, will learn valuable lessons from these errors. He also believes there's significant value for individual listeners in understanding these decision-making processes, empowering them to critically evaluate information during future crises, and even in their everyday lives. How do you know what to believe?
That's useful.
He ultimately presents his book as a tool for better understanding both societal and individual decision-making, how we think, how groups think.
So for listeners who want to delve deeper into this, what does Zweig recommend? Obviously, the book.
Yes, he strongly encourages everyone to read his book, An Abundance of Caution, which came out April 22nd. He also maintains a Substack newsletter at silentlunch.net.
Silentlunch.net. Why that name?
He explains that the name Silent Lunch refers to the practice imposed on many American schoolchildren during the pandemic, where they were not allowed to speak while eating. Masks off, so no talking.
Oh, wow. I remember hearing about that. That image of children forced to eat in silence is quite disturbing.
It is. And Zweig points out that this was not a federal mandate, but was implemented in a large number of schools across the country. Another one of those local decisions. And he suggests that the long-term consequences of these policies on this generation of children are still largely unknown, indicating that he will likely continue to explore these issues on his Substack platform. What does this mean for them years down the road?
Right, the story isn't over.
Yeah.
This has been a truly illuminating deep dive. Thank you for shedding light on this important perspective from Zweig's work.
My pleasure. The core takeaway, as I see it, for you listening, is that our examination of the school closures reveals some fundamental flaws in how critical decisions were made. It highlights the real dangers of accepting unchallenged narratives and underscores the vital importance of questioning established wisdom, not just in the context of a pandemic, but in every aspect of our lives. Asking why and where's the evidence?
It really makes you think, what other seemingly obvious societal responses might be based more on gut feeling or political pressure or, just inertia than on solid, verifiable evidence?
Exactly.
And what might be the long-term unintended consequences of those decisions? Definitely something to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.